following program contains scenes of sexuality, violence, coarse language, and adult themes. Because it's awesome! Viewer discretion is advised. Episode 7, Glowy Box has become a time machine. Because we're going back to the 1980s with our look at what women were doing in video games in that decade. It's impossible to cover everything that was going on in a half-hour show, so I decided to present a sampling of 10 things I thought were important in this decade. The 1980s were a decade defined by President Ronald Reagan's Morning in America metaphor. It was a decade of excess, in fashion, in music, and in culture. As much as we think the battles over gender, sexuality, and race are new, the 80s had Boy George challenging gender norms, Madonna shattering modesty standards, and Michael Jackson and Whitney Houston turning black music into pop music. And video games were beginning a very shaky rise to dominance in media. Contrary to popular belief, women have been contributing to video games from the very beginning, starting with the first female video game developer, Joyce Weisbecker, who coded TV Schoolhouse for RCA in 1976. The number 10 spot on our countdown starts in the 70s, when the hits of the early 80s were being designed. So let's kick off this show with a look at the women who helped build Atari. The importance of Atari to the rise of the Western video game industry can't be overstated. Atari brought us the first hit coin-operated video game, Pong, and the first smash hit video game home console, the Atari 2600. Much of this groundbreaking work was done by women with skills, including communication skills, transplanted from other industries. Carol Cantor brought the market research methods developed for supermarket products to video games. And Muriel Chevalier didn't even speak English when Atari hired her, but she grew up in the gambling industry in France and expanded Atari's business to Europe. We still fight to the death about how to include more women in the video game industry, but it seems that Atari co-founder Nolan Bushnell may have figured out that magic formula in 1972. This is how Lonnie Reeder, Department Liaison and Coordinator for the Communications, Security, Facilities, and Architectural Design Departments, you can tell it was a startup, describes her time at Atari. The company and culture at Atari provided the blueprint for my professional life and beyond. I learned a lot from Nolan. I call it my MBA under fire. More knowledge and experience than I ever attained in college. And it's not to say that we agreed on all issues, because we would definitely give each other pushback. But there was the freedom to do that in Nolan's ventures, knowing that info and opinions could be exchanged by everyone in a safe space where there were no targeted repercussions for giving Nolan that pushback. Nolan has always been about teamships and elevating ideas, even if the ideas weren't his. A man confident with his own skill set, he never felt threatened by other equally strong opinionated individuals. Sadly, this is not currently considered Nolan Bushnell's legacy regarding women. Much has been made of the sex, drugs, and video game culture of Atari in the 1970s. However, over a dozen women who worked there say that their jobs at Atari were the best jobs they ever had. As the 1970s rolled into the 1980s, women had gone from housewives to career women in only a decade, and a lot of stuff was still getting sorted out. It's important to judge Atari and its beleaguered founder in the context of the time, and to respect the views of the women who worked at the company who saw it as a positive experience. By treating these women as poor, defenseless victims, it undermines the fact that their ideas contributed to the foundation of the video game industry. It's undeniable that in the 1970s, Atari hired, retained, and promoted women at a rapid rate. And those women helped make Atari the fastest growing company in America in the 1970s. These women helped change entertainment forever, getting video game consoles into millions of homes. But they were also a part of creating a new destination for gaming outside of the house: arcades. Atari's provocative image had a marketing purpose. It made video games and the amusement arcades that stocked them seem sexy. Why? Because arcades wanted to be date night destinations. After 35-year US state bans on pinball machines were lifted in the 1970s, arcades filled the need for teenagers who were too young to go to bars, but too old to do kid stuff. A few pinball machines could also attract teenagers and young adults to a local restaurant or movie theater, and because these machines were automated, the establishments didn't have to hire more staff. Computer games had existed since the 1960s, but they were too complicated for the guy with a beer in a bar. Atari combined computing with the simple ideas of carnival games to create competitors for those pinball machines. Pong, the first smash hit arcade game, couldn't get more simple. Two white bars that slid up and down. The object of the game was immediately intuitive. Don't let the moving pixel get past your bar. Yeah, pixels were that big in 1972. In 1978, Space Invaders was another quantum leap for video games, but amusement arcade owners had a problem. While men loved the new machines, women, not so much. 1980 was when all that changed and the golden age of arcade video games really hit its stride. Pac-Man, complete with color graphics and enemies with AI that was advanced for the time, took the world by storm. Pac-Man was designed to appeal to women. It was bright, it was kawaii, it appealed to players of various skill levels, and it wasn't military themed. Pac-Man was my first video game, and it's probably led to many kids of the 1980s, male and female alike, becoming gamers for life. But it was the sequel to Pac-Man that made a surprisingly feminist statement, and that's number 8 on this list. She wasn't a Miss, she wasn't a Mrs., she was Ms. Pac-Man. And in 1982, that was still considered kind of radically feminist. Ms. was the name of the prominent liberal feminist magazine founded by Gloria Steinem and Dorothy Pittman Hughes, and that feminist prefix, unattached to a woman's marital status, was as heated a topic back then as the pronoun wars are today. The Ms. prefix had been around as a short form for mistress since the 17th century, but for traditionalists, the Ms. pronoun was treated as indicative of the downfall of family values in society at large. Those of us who lived through dinner table rants over Ms. get a real sense of deja vu when people get just as worked up today over preferred pronouns. Ms. Pac-Man was intended to be a thank you to the female players that had helped make the original Pac-Man such a success. But because of the story told in the cutscenes between levels, the female Pac-Man had a prefix problem. Within the game, Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man meet, fall in love, and have a baby, and it was out of the question to have a character have a baby out of wedlock in 1982, even though that character was just a yellow circle with a bow on her head. So Miss Pac-Man was out. But Mrs. Pac-Man invoked the moms of the young people in arcades, not the players themselves. And that got to the heart of why women needed a prefix not linked to marriage. Heroines need names that can evolve with them as they move through life, that incorporate their whole story. And there were other 1980s-style feminist elements of Miss Pac-Man. The fact that she was the enhanced, improved version of her predecessor. In cutscenes, when Pac-Man chased her, she chased him right back. And in the era of the supermodel and the thigh master, Ms. Pac-Man's cabinet art was a prototype plus-sized pinup. It's a real sign of the times that today, Ms. Pac-Man is dismissed by some as a Miss Male character. After the monster success of Pac-Man, copycats were everywhere. But Ms. Pac-Man wasn't a copy. Ms. Pac-Man was an acknowledgement that Pac-Man had always been a game series for women who supplied 60% of the quarters that went into those machines. The makers of gaming's most notorious 1980s bad girl also understood the importance of appealing to female players. Long before Lara Croft, there was Carmen Sandiego. Kids of the 1980s like me have fond memories of playing computer games in school. When we weren't dying of dysentery in the Oregon Trail, we were chasing criminals around the world, dodging knives, bullets, and terrible puns, arming ourselves with problem solving and a knowledge of geography. The arch nemesis of school kids starting in 1985 was a crimson-coated Latina super spy, Carmen Sandiego. Carmen Sandiego was based on Portuguese-born Brazilian samba singer Carmen Miranda, and some of Carmen's henchpeople were named after women who worked at Broderbund, the company that made the game. Catherine Dribb was named after Catherine Bird, Carmen's project manager, and Carmen herself was modeled after Marcia Bell, Broderbund's marketing manager. The Carmen design team saw a female lead as a positive since it would help women as well as men connect with the game. Where in the world is Carmen Sandiego became the best-selling educational software in North America, which is quite a feat considering it wasn't intended to be educational software in the first place. Instead, it was conceived to be a cops and robbers adventure game for children inspired by the 1970s text classic Colossal Cave Adventure. Broderbund's management knew that educational translated into kids speak as boring, so even after Carmen became a hit, they referred to the games as explorational, not educational. But educators loved the game because it taught facts and familiarized kids with computers, which were then still new, confusing, and potentially intimidating technology. Carmen Sandiego became one of the longest-running game franchises of all time. It's been spun off into TV shows and a card game, and Netflix is producing a series about Carmen's origin story. But 1985 is also where gaming's gender coding problem began, due to circumstances beyond its control. Between 1983 and 1985, the Western video game industry suffered what's become known as Atari shock, a collapse in the sales of video games due to too much of everything, but especially too many cheap, crappy games. However, the game that became emblematic of the poor quality rush job games of the late Atari era was the opposite of cheap. It cost Atari $20 to $25 million just for the licensing rights for the E.T. the Extraterrestrial game. E.T.'s director, Steven Spielberg, handpicked Howard Scott Warshaw, the acclaimed designer of a truly awesome game, Yar's Revenge, to make the E.T. game. But in order to make Christmas shopping season deadlines, Warshaw had to create an incredibly high-profile game in 5.5 weeks. And it was the best damn game made in 5.5 weeks ever! Which doesn't mean it was objectively good. E.T. wasn't even the right color. Cue financial and critical disaster of such magnitude that 728,000 unsold cartridges were buried in the desert outside of Alamogordo, New Mexico. This symbolic end to the second console era led to 2 years in the wilderness for the Western video game industry, which has caused periodic soiling of trousers in game developers ever since. Stores were so done with video games that the game console that saved the whole console industry could only get into American stores by pretending to be a toy, forcing video games into the gender coding of toy sales. Thanks to second wave feminism, gender coding in toys hit a historic low in 1975. But then the separation between toys and girl toys started creeping back into marketing, and by the mid-80s, Barbie and He-Man weren't in the same part of the store. Meanwhile, in Japan, video games had never gone away, and kids were playing with the family computer, or Famicom, a video game system much more advanced than the Atari systems had been. In 1985, the Famicom sneaked into North American toy stores under a new name, pretending to be a support system for a rudimentary toy robot. Because of that robot, the Nintendo Entertainment System was classified as a toy for boys, and that was the beginning of the deliberate male gender coding of console video games. Ironically, the Nintendo Entertainment System became a hit precisely because its original killer app was a game beloved by boys and girls. It was a simple story about a plumber who saves a princess from a turtle dragon monster, Super Mario Bros. Super Mario Bros. Eventually sold over 40 million copies and brought the video game industry back from the Atari crash. The game's fairy tale setting, mushroom-based mechanics that reminded Western players of Alice in Wonderland, and a princess in a ball gown gave Super Mario a broad appeal that other early Nintendo games about duck hunting and gunning down gangsters didn't have. It was that princess, named Peach in Japan and Princess Toadstool in the English manuals, that signaled to many little girls that Mario games were for them too. The intense criticism of Peach in feminist circles is precisely because there's so much familiarity with her from women's childhoods. For the record though, I wasn't one of those princess girls. I hated princesses like I hate The Sims. I hate The Sims. The other Nintendo princess that critics love to trash is Princess Zelda, the title character of the 1986 fantasy action-adventure game The Legend of Zelda. Named after American flapper Zelda Fitzgerald, Zelda's intelligence has become an emblem of the franchise. She's associated with the Triforce of Wisdom, alongside Link and the Triforce of Courage and Ganon's connection to the Triforce of Power. Right from the beginning of the series, Zelda has outsmarted more powerful foes to buy time until Link can assist her in defeating that villain. While the focus of the series is on the coming-of-age metaphor of the young male hero, Zelda is no simple damsel in distress. And Zelda isn't the only prominent woman in Zelda games. Impa, originally Zelda's nursemaid, and the trio of golden goddesses who created Hyrule continue to be major parts of the games in the series. The popular perception that the women of Nintendo in the 1980s just existed in poofy dresses and got kidnapped by assholes isn't fair. In fact, Nintendo had its own 1980s female action hero inspired by the film Alien, Samus Aran. The idea to make Samus female was introduced midway through the development of the 1987 sci-fi platformer Metroid, and Samus's gender wasn't revealed until the player beat the game in under 3 hours. The discovery of Samus's gender was a defining moment for many gamers in the 1980s. While many girls my age played Super Mario, I was the only girl I knew who played Metroid. It's impossible to describe how huge a deal it was that such an aggressive, powerful character was female. Unlike Everyman Mario or the youthfully innocent Link, Samus was the galaxy's best bounty hunter. She was a mature, aggressive heroine at the height of her abilities in a game primarily aimed at boys. Samus Aran didn't just pave the way for women to be at the center of the action in video games. Metroid's non-linear exploration-based platforming format established an entire category of games. Now, the way that the game revealed that Samus was a girl has been subjected to some criticism. Samus appearing in a bodysuit and a bikini is seen by modern sentiments to be objectifying. But how else were 8-bit graphics and MIDI sounds supposed to make it clear that Samus was female without showing her body? Besides, in the glamazon zeitgeist of the 1980s, Bikini Samus wasn't seen as objectified. She was seen as physically and socially powerful. Nintendo used Western archetypes to make its games less threatening to Americans, but unlike the beefcake stars of American films at the time, Japanese video games showed that people who didn't look like Schwarzenegger and Stallone could still be heroes. That included women with different skills. Peach was kind, Zelda was wise, Samus was all kinds of kick-ass. These female characters showed that, even in an industry forced to market primarily to males, that women could make their mark. But what about behind the scenes? A similar trend was taking place. Though a workplace minority, both in gaming and in general society, women were making their mark in video games. And there's no better example of this on the engineering side than Carol Shaw. Carol Shaw was a hardcore computer programmer and one of those Atari women I talked about earlier. But it wasn't until she moved to Activision that she made her best-known game, the 1982 war shooter River Raid. River Raid was one of the first games to use procedurally generated environments, which lets games generate content on the fly and use less data space. Interestingly, it was also one of the first games banned for young people in Germany based on allegations that playing the game was harmful to their minds. When a game developer manages to make technical innovations and defend the mental hygiene police, this is considered doing it right. By many accounts, Carol Shaw had been undervalued at Atari. She was one of only 2 female engineers. The other was Carla Meninsky, who developed Indy 500 and Dodgem. But it was Shaw who was, retroactively, seen as one of the best programmers, male or female, at Atari. She was so good that she co-authored the coding manual that other designers used. She was responsible for doing difficult coding work on other people's games. Programmers like this tend to be neglected when it comes to credit at companies. But worse, game developers didn't have profit participation at Atari, so when a game became a huge hit, they didn't make any more money. This led to the founding of Activision, video games' first third-party game development company. Third party means a company that makes games, but that doesn't make a game console. You probably know Activision as a publisher of franchises like Call of Duty, Destiny, and Skylanders, but in the early 1980s, it was the place for disgruntled Atari employees to go to make some real money. Carol Shaw turned out to also be a skilled level designer, and River Raid was an early hit for Activision. So Carol Shaw made a fair bit of money off the success of the game. This allowed her to be financially comfortable after the gaming industry crashed in 1983. It can be lonely at the top, so fortunately, Carol Shaw had some very good company in the 1980s, developers on the home computer side of gaming. With her husband Corey, Lori-Ann Cole developed the wildly popular and influential Quest for Glory series, some of the most creative, replayable, and beloved adventure games ever. The Quest for Glory series combined a skill point system, role-playing elements, puzzle-based adventuring, captivating worlds, and gloriously bad puns that let young nerds discover what it was to be a hero in 1989. Even though the playable character in Quest for Glory games is male, the games were chock full of prominent, memorable female characters, like the fairy Arana, the mysterious Katrina, Uhura, who was doing the Black Panther thing way before Black Panther was in theaters, and the cat-like Shema, as well as Shema's dance that inspired an entire generation of gamer furries. It's hypnotic. You can't look away. Lori-Ann Cole is, unlike some people who write video games, actually an avid gamer herself. Also, unlike many other names on this list, the Coles are still involved in making video games. Their latest game, Hero U, is coming out very soon, which is why Lori wasn't able to participate in this special. Quest for Glory 4 also started the voice acting career of Jennifer Hale, which in itself makes these games important to gaming history. Lori Cole did voice acting herself in the next entry on this list. King's Quest co-creator Roberta Williams is one of the most beloved figures in the history of gaming. Now mostly retired, she was a fearless, prolific video game creator starting with the 1980 Apple II adventure game Mystery House, one of the first adventure games with actual graphics. Then came the direct precursor to King's Quest, The Wizard and the Princess, which was the first adventure game to have full color graphics. But it was King's Quest, the story of a noodle-armed yellow-skinned servant of the King of Daventry, that just had something magical about it. Yes, it was the first adventure game to use interactive on-screen animation, but it also had just enough silliness, sense of scope, challenge, and wonder that it captivated the imagination of gamers in 1984 in a way that no console game could. Other than King's Quest, Williams designed the mixed-up Mother Goose edutainment game, The Colonel's Bequest, which was the first game to feature the female playable character Laura Bow, and the female-led Phantasmagoria, a horror game notable for its graphic violence, gore, and sexual content. Phantasmagoria showed Williams' willingness to take technical and creative risks, and the breadth of her output is still unmatched in gaming. King's Quest games became training grounds for other adventure game programmers like Scott Murphy, the co-creator of Space Quest, Al Lowe, the creator of Leisure Suit Larry, and Jane Jensen, the creator of Gabriel Knight. This training ground model created an adventure game dynasty for the Williams' company, Sierra Online, through the 1980s and 1990s. Roberta Williams was the queen of 1980s computer gaming, but far fewer people actually owned computers compared to today. A successful computer game could sell a few 100,000 copies, while millions of people played arcade games. And one game stood out as not only being played by a large number of women, but it was also coded by a woman. Top of our list, number 1, Centipede. Centipede was the co-creation of Ed Logg and Donna Bailey at Atari, letting us end this show where we began. Donna Bailey had previously been a programmer working on cruise control systems at General Motors. After taking an interest in Space Invaders, she discovered that Atari coin-op arcade games used the same microprocessors she worked on for cars. She liked the idea that eventually became Centipede because of its relative non-violence. In Bailey's mind, it wasn't so bad to shoot a bug. In 1980, Bailey was the only woman in Atari's coin-op division, and the woman's touch on Centipede is clear. The pastel colors, the non-violent violence, and even the novel trackball controller all made the game more accessible for women, which made up a full half of its player base. Centipede was a big reason that I got to spend as much time in arcades as I did when I was a kid, because my mother liked Centipede. And what better reason to give something top spot on a countdown show than the fact that my mom liked it, right? Centipede also makes for a really sweet episode trophy that I didn't have to make. A small embodiment of the games made by, for, and about women in the 1980s. On to the shelf. So that's it! Our first historical Lady Bits retrospective. Thanks for watching. Like what you see? Donations are appreciated, and monthly Patreon backers get access to a special bonus episode. And of course, please share this episode on your social media. Next episode, we'll move from the Atari and Nintendo eras to the decade of the PlayStation, the 1990s. For now, I'd like to give the last word to Lonnie Reeder, one of those early female gaming pioneers. She told me this: I know that who gets the credit battles and gender wars are front and center with game design extremists today. It really is sad, not to mention unproductive, and my personal hope is that everyone can somehow get back to the concept of focusing on awesome games taking front and center. Let innovation and creativity rule. Hopefully this show lived up to those standards. I'm Leanna Kersner. Thanks for letting me show you my very 1980s style Lady Bits. Not me though. I hated princesses like I hate The Sims. I hate The Sims. Perfect timing, Link.
Good job, Link.
Link, your game's coming up next.